I appreciate it, Sarah.
Okay.
It's a day. It's okay.
Okay, all good.
There we go. It's not recorded, so no one knows.
And by myself.
No. Yeah.
He
already knows. We had-
Yeah.
It's not.
Little diamond thing?
I never.
And me, it looks like a shape with some things on the top, right? That first.
Oh, the training. Your only child.
Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
that's on
That's
your
quite
computer.
interesting. I'm gonna get rid of that. Yeah, I'll take it over.
I get so spicy after me, like.
Is that good, Natasha? Okay, awesome, we'll jump into it. So I wanted to do a few things kind of for today, talking about, given everything that's been going on this year and also just in general, since we're still in the pandemic, we're still talking via over, covered faces and all those fun things to talk a bit about some mental health and wellness and hopefully focusing on some tools and ways you can help to engage more effectively for yourself, but also for the students you're working with and for. But just some ground rules, especially as we have kind of more of an honest and more vulnerable conversation, is being mindful of the voices present and those who are missing. And so if you're someone who usually doesn't speak up, I encourage you to speak up if you're comfortable. Maybe challenge by choice there too. If you're someone who takes up oftentimes lots of space, be mindful of that as well. Being vulnerable, we'll let you define vulnerability in a bit, but I want to make sure to kind of be mindful of what that looks like, what it means to be vulnerable, to be mindful about being willing to share up yourself. Oftentimes these kind of conversations are only as good as when we're able to engage them. Engage with each other, we'll give you some chances to do some reflections, some sharing. So I just ask you all are willing to put in some space to that. As always, take lessons and leave the names. So take what you've learned, but also if anyone shares their experiences, leave those personal stories behind. Always be mindful in conversation about intention versus impact. So, something that we say might not always have the intention of hurting somebody else, but it sometimes can. And so be mindful of how you can engage in that effectively. And my rule, as always, is my Northeasternness sometimes comes out. I can talk a bit quickly, so I apologize in advance, but tell me to slow down if I need to. So there's 4 terms I threw up there for some common language, and I'll define them in just a minute, but I wanted to kind of also be mindful too of anyone else's other terms they think about when it comes to mental health, when it comes to wellness, and our students and leadership about other terms I think are important for us to talk about. Anyone's in the chat, they can just unmute themselves and join in, or anyone in the room in person can also just share out. Any other terms that people might want to add? So then focusing then on just these 4, I define them all with some language that we think are pretty important. And I want to make sure we have common language. I think it's just important that we have a common understanding and a common vernacular, but also oftentimes there's a lot of ways in which people might interpret personally some things. And so at least for the sake of our conversation today, I wanted to make sure it was more commonly understood in terms of things we would like to see from language, and kind of being mindful of some of the things that oftentimes I know I've seen pop up the most on campus with students and with colleagues. So authenticity is really kind of cultivating the courage to be emotionally honest, setting boundaries, and allowing ourselves to be vulnerable. I define vulnerability below that, but I think it's really important to be mindful that oftentimes a lot of our students might think authenticity and vulnerability can be sharing every part of themselves. And so I think the boundary piece in there is a really critical part of the definition. Too often, I think people don't always set boundaries and see that as being able to be authentic. Not everyone always deserves your full authenticity right away. Like, it's important to be mindful of how much you want to build trust with somebody like that, what it looks like. It's also important that we have to kind of let go of what we are supposed to be and embrace who we are. The vulnerability definition is pretty important to me, is in terms of being it's uncertainty, it's risk, and emotional exposure, but it's also not weakness. And really it takes a lot of courage to do that, oftentimes more so for those coming from spaces where they've been marginalized. And so being mindful that oftentimes vulnerability isn't easy for everybody, and it takes more for some people in the context, depending on, for example, how power is experienced in spaces, systems that are at play, and all those other different aspects as well too. Imposter syndrome is something that I've seen a lot from talking from students, especially oftentimes from women and women of color, and the ways in which it can impact and really show up negatively how people can be believe that oftentimes their success is not as always deserved. And that oftentimes they may downplay their own efforts or skills. And so it's important to be mindful of the ways in which that can really be detrimental in mental health for ourselves and our students. Oftentimes that can connect to shame, right? So like the thing that washes over us kind of feeling flawed and then questioning kind of our worth and our worthiness of belonging and connection. And so I give these kind of just 4 definitions. Obviously, there's way more than this, but I want to just kind of focus on these 4, being mindful about for ourselves as staff and faculty, and for ourselves and our roles as we work with students, and also as we show up in our own spaces as individuals, it's important to be mindful of how we engage effectively in these ways and spaces. So if you can, on whatever thing you need to, you have some paper, great. If not on your phone, that's fine too. I'm asking you all to practice some vulnerability here and to write 3 sentences about yourself in the voice of a teammate, colleague, or individual with whom you struggle. And I promise there's a perspective to this. And not everyone's going to share this one out, but we're going to start with something here for the sake of it. So take like 2 minutes, write 3 sentences about yourself in the voice of a teammate, colleague, or individual with whom you struggle. So if you've been on a team with experience, somebody you really didn't get along great with, or just had opposing viewpoints with, try and just think about 3 sentences. It doesn't have to be a catastrophic takedown of yourself. It could be some very simple, disagreement pieces you've had, what that might look like. So what I ask you to do is take a few more minutes to reflect on one of these 3 questions, or all 3 if you have time, depending on how much you want to jump into it. And you can pick the question, kind of challenge again by choice. What about your experience with that person made the relationship challenging? So I think maybe contextually, was there certain factors at play? Being mindful of, what was the role that you had in that situation? Was there a space in which maybe that person felt more empowered to you? Or you felt more empowered than them, or if there's dynamics happening organizationally, where were you in your own life in that moment in time? How might that person have perceived or received you in a way that did not match your intention? Again, that point of intention versus impact. Or also, how might you have perceived or received that person in a way that did not match their intention? Anyone willing to share one of the reflections? I know for myself, I was thinking about a former colleague of mine. One of the pieces of feedback I got from them when we were working through some training setups and coordination is they felt oftentimes they felt dismissed by me. And it definitely was not my intention and impact. So I know myself thinking about you know, the way in which my intentions did not match that, right? In the way in which it was perceived or received. I think because I was able to speak in pretty honestly and openly about things in ways that I've been raised to do and think about, right, that actually created a negative impact on her in the way in which she showed up in that space. And so I give it an example, something I know I've thought about a lot and something I've helped me be mindful of in terms of how I show up in spaces, given my social identities I have, my positional leadership also, but additionally also kind of just interpersonal dynamic wise. Definitely wasn't the goal. There were some things that we just had a disagreement on. And so I never tried to make that person feel that way. But again, that's what I felt. So all I could do was kind of work through the impact piece and try to make sure that it didn't happen again. So the reason why I bring these things up and I start here, right? It's a bit more of a, you know, kind of a more reflective way to start it. Not, we might not say it's the most positive thing, but I'm going to start it off in part because I think it's easy to armor up the situations, right? So I'm going to talk a lot about today about kind of that armoring up process. Oftentimes we put a lot of armor on when it comes to conversations. We oftentimes get a little anxious about what it means for us. Sometimes that comes out of self-preservation. For a variety of reasons. It could be because of identities we have in spaces where we don't feel safe. It could also just be because we don't have the emotional safety pieces. And I think being mindful of the ways in which our student leaders engage in this, there's so many times in which they are engaging, you know, actively and transitioning throughout their day and their week and their lives, where they don't feel these things. You know, typically, you know, I hear from a lot of students about how they oftentimes kind of still see professors in a way that they kind of really hold on to a lot of knowledge and don't necessarily share that with them. They don't always feel empowered in certain spaces. You know, maybe they're in organizational settings where that's a thing. They might have family dynamics or personal dynamics at home or interpersonal dynamics in their lives that make that harder. And so, you know, so I'd say, like to say, you know, kind of, and this is a quote that I hear a lot. And for me, it's been kind of a very good way that I hope to be mindful of the ways in which I engage with people. I try to also modify it. Theodore Roosevelt did not say that much more personal. It was very male-based language. I tried to modify it to be a bit more broad for our purposes today also. But I think it's always about like the person who's in the arena with you, what that means in terms of that. And so it's been a big kind of jumping off point for how kind of we engage in some of the concepts around kind of armored leadership and what that means. And so armored leadership comes from Brene Brown, who's a PhD social work professor out of University of Houston. She's done a lot of major books and other things. To me, this is one of the most helpful pieces of leadership education I've done in myself in finding ways to be more mindful and open and engaging with other people and engaging with each other and with ourselves and trying to find ways to be more honest in how we actually can be intentional in how we choose to engage in spaces and ways. And so, you know, the armor piece is a question of what it is oftentimes that we, how we show up in spaces that we put on armor for, right? It's not always kind of a Mandalorian style suit or a coat of arms. Sometimes it's really about that kind of emotional ways in which we armor up. It's the ways in which maybe given, again, interpersonal dynamics and stuff that are playing out or how we've been raised, how we choose to show up in spaces, we might feel like we have to armor up in certain ways. And because we've been socialized in certain ways or the ways that our voices are or not being heard in spaces that make us armor up. And so it's important to recognize how we do that. And the opposite of armor is that daring piece. What it means to try and move beyond that kind of dichotomy area. And so what I'm going to ask you all to do, for those online, you see, and actually for everyone in the room too, on Teams in the today's tag, the most recent one, you will see that there was a document I put there too with a worksheet and ask you all to spend some time with. today. For those in the room, I can go up on screen so we can walk through a bit of it. And to me, this is such an important part of being mindful of mental health and wellness when it comes to our student leaders. I think oftentimes, we've seen a lot of news, right, recently about Facebook and things and the ways in which our social media is being really geared towards people and impacting us negatively. What it means in terms of our self-image, our self-esteem. And it's important to recognize there's lots of ways in which kind of Renee goes through and points out some of the places in which people oftentimes armor up. And the kind of opposite of that is, again, that daring piece and ways in which we can try and move beyond that. So, the first one for me is a thing I see a lot on campus. I see a lot from our students. Recently Natasha and I got to do and run our Spark program, which is our Women of Color First Year Retreat. And actually this was a big theme throughout the conversation, which is around perfectionism. We heard several students ask pretty explicitly, like, how do you deal with perfectionism? How can you try and be perfect? What does that mean? And that's pretty challenging because we had a mentor panelist experience, and one of them said it beautifully, which she asked the question simply, name one person who's perfect, and no one could. And so I think there's a nice kind of sobering moment there for the students, but I think realistically, a lot of students, especially being mindful of the kind of students we work with who are high achieving, what that means for us and that pressure that's put on themselves and what it looks like. There's that kind of false fear of failure, right? What does that mean to fail? We know we've seen students on campus where maybe for the first time have a class we're not doing well. What does it mean for them? And it's hard, right? So it's a big challenge. Where oftentimes they have a lot of pressure on themselves to perform in a certain way. If it's with the student organization, if it's an internship or a job, especially internships, be mindful of the ways in which we know students have a lot of pressure because everyone says, you have to perform great in order to get that job offer from them, or if that becomes a job offer, and if not, it might be on you. What does that mean? And so there's lots of that conversation out there. And oftentimes this leads to really strong and some challenging mental health consequences for our students. The opposite is kind of what it means to kind of model and encourage healthy striving. And I think to me, it's a great term I like a lot. And for me, it's worked connected well, especially with students in the past. And here to recognize like, you can't get it perfect and get it right, but what does it mean to be honest and okay to like keep working towards it? What does it mean also to have self-compassion? I know a lot of students are pretty easy to, forgive others, but less so themselves. They hold themselves on a pedestal that oftentimes is pretty dangerous, that they're going to fall from and get hurt from. And so when that fall happens, and so it's important to consider, right? Like, what does it mean to model and encourage that? I posed 2 questions specifically to think about. But I think it's a really good thing to consider, right? Like, what's the difference between striving for excellence and perfectionism? How does it show up for yourself? Oftentimes, I think to me, this is something I go back to a lot. I know when I started this role, I thought a lot about like the ways in which I can make sure I don't have those issues and challenges by trying to make sure I have very realistic and honest understanding from myself, from others, from my supervisors, from my team, what that means, what they need to be successful, and how they see my role being successful, what does it look like? And for me, it's helped me make sure I'm kind of grounded in that way that keeps me from doing that, right? Because I think for me, I define success in certain ways, specifically for certain programs and things. And so it keeps me from kind of that fostering fear of failure. I think a lot of us have felt in the pandemic, especially nowadays, where we know a lot of teams across campus are understaffed. We know we're being asked to do more, not less. Oftentimes being asked to do more with less. And at some point, that's been an ask for a lot of people for a long time. And so it's challenging where oftentimes that alone can drive that towards that. And so I think it's important to ask the question of like, what does it mean for us to do, right? Like, how do we strive for excellence, and also in a way that's healthy? What do you need to do in order to model and encourage daring behaviors? Like, what do you need to do in your space, organizationally, with your team, with yourself to do that? And what do others need from you to engage in those kind of more daring pieces of behaviors? I'm willing to share out any thoughts I have. Yeah.
I think sometimes the perfectionism piece is very limiting. So like if you're striving for excellence and you don't get there, like to pull up short to make it perfect is like cut yourself off at the knees.
Yeah, absolutely.
I
saying something in regard to like how to model and encourage daring behaviors, I think it kind of, like it says it in itself, like for the leadership within the office, and just because, or you don't have the title, you know, to be the leadership in the office. I think role modeling failure and how you process failure is really important. And that failure is not necessarily that it all crumbled and nothing happened, or it could be, right? Like there's different ways of defining failure. And it's up to the person to decide if that is a failure, because more than likely it actually wasn't a failure, but it takes the processing to do it. And so how do you role model healthy failing? And being willing to go back to like your common language, like being vulnerable and saying, wow, you know, like if I didn't put the energy that I needed to put into this project, and you know, it was successful, but here's my areas of improvement, versus like, you know, only 5 people came and that's a failure. I think it's really important to role model like what your own expectations are, so that others can say, well, that's, you know, like what Sarah did and what she processed through it, and now this is what we're gonna do, versus like, I know Sarah expects me to have 5,000 people at this thing, and if I don't, that equals failure.
Thanks, Sarah. I think also you asked the question, Sarah, you bring up a great point. I'd love to hear from somebody else too, especially being online, pulling this year out, is when's the time that you help a student fail well? So I think there's a way you can make them fail where they feel awful and they feel really, you know, pretty terrible, but eventually where they fail, but also, you know, can come out learning things better. You know, obviously not every time someone's in crisis, you expect them to always become better at the end of it. I think it's a pretty tough request to have, but just in terms of a failure, if it was a, you know, an internship they didn't get, you know, a program that fell apart maybe, or they didn't go where they wanted to, how are you able to help that student like fail gracefully or fail effectively?
This happens a lot with student organization registration. Dealt with a lot of folks being like, I failed that organization, I failed, you know, myself, I failed all these different realms. And I really just allow for them to talk that through and like process that through, like Sarah was saying, because a lot of times they don't have a space on campus to just like talk, like they might have a peer to like, you know, just like gripe with, but I think to actually like, again, like the process piece. So just asking them questions and, you know, really getting them to reflect deeper and deeper is something that I try to do, so that, okay, next time, what are you gonna do differently? And then like actually walking them through the steps of how it will be differently next time. And usually like just that, those kind of end caps will help quite a bit. Yeah.
I would definitely echo that. And I think sometimes when you do have those conversations, you find that it's not actually like I failed this thing. It's that these things are happening in my universe, or the impressions that I've received or the intentions that have been put on me is why I am now projecting this like ideology of failure. So I definitely agree with you.
The next one is an important one too, and they're all important, but you know, it's that question of like working from scarcity. I think this is something that's very explicitly right now happening on campus, right? Like we all kind of think attest to what that means is challenging budget restrictions. Obviously, just like the challenge limitations for how we can how we've had to reconceive the work that we do, just given a pandemic. What it looks like, that alone is a scarcity piece, but what does it mean in terms of kind of squandering those opportunities? But what does it also look like to practice gratitude and celebrate milestones and victories? I think it's pretty easy given the fact that oftentimes a lot of our virtual spaces don't always actually support positive things. Like we know those on track as well for whatever algorithmic reasons that people created for that. And so it's important to question, like, to me, how does your leadership enable you to celebrate and experience joy? You know, how are you thinking about how you're operating intentionally around these spaces, that you're able to take those moments? You know, if it's hard for you to do that, the question then is why? And that is a really deep question. So it's not one I'm going to try to answer right now. But I think it's a question also, right? Like, how are you creating opportunities to recognize and celebrate others and celebrate other experiences with you, right? So it's important to really question those things. Numbing is a big one, right? We see a lot of students. We know it's an issue on not just weekends, but you know, kind of throughout the day, what that means in terms of that. And I think there's a big challenge and a big difference between numbing and versus finding comfort. I know I've seen a lot of students numb by just kind of laying on the couch and watching a binge or whatever that show or movie is. It's pretty easy, right? That the 3, 2, 1 counts down, the next one's going on. But oftentimes people don't report kind of feeling like restful and actually recovered from those experiences, right? But so it's a really just kind of, it's an escapist route that is still armor, right? Because it keeps you having to oftentimes deal with finding ways to actually fully recover. Like, what do you need to do to get yourself fully right and taken care of? And how can you work to recognize your feelings, what are they and where they come from, in that piece instead of numbing. And again, that's not a simple thing to do. That's pretty challenging. It's complex, it's deep. But I think my biggest question I have for you all is like, how do you build habits for genuine renewal and comfort that aren't just numbing? Like, what does it look like in small ways that you can do that at work, in your day, or in ways that you can help students to recognize how they can try and move away from numbing activities? Doesn't have to be dramatic, gigantic, monumental shifts, but can be small ones too.
I think one of your earlier words about guilt can come up here, or you said shame.
Yeah.
But guilt, I think, because I hear often where people are doing self-care and they're minimizing it or feeling guilty that they're doing it.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting American perspective, that they shouldn't be spending time for, whatever that self-care looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. Number 4 is kind of really about, the focus on kind of the, victimhood piece. It's the kind of crush or be crushed, right? It's that whole kind of zero-sum mentality, I think, in terms of ways and words, what that means. I think it's pretty tough and challenging. Oftentimes I feel like when you look at, again, part of it's how we define success for ourselves, right? Where that comes from. I think it's a question of like, what does success and failure look like? And if it's a zero-sum piece, that's pretty challenging in terms of that. It really sets up automatically a winner and a loser. And it creates a real dichotomy there, kind of some real juxtaposition of what it can be. And I think it's important to be mindful of like what does it mean to show up and be vulnerable and courageous in ways. Brene has language around what it means in terms of kind of a integration of the strong back, soft front piece, right? So what does it mean to stand firm and stand tall, and also to be willing to be open and to be honest. And you can do both at the same time. That's also very hard, right? To be willing to take those things together. I think it's important to be mindful again, like are there ways in which you feel like you've seen students operate in zero-sum spaces, right? But if it's, if an event does or doesn't happen, if a certain experience does or doesn't happen, right? Like, what does it look like when those things take place? And how does it also impact that, right? Like, where are the ways in which you're getting messaging, in society speaking, kind of more broadly, about what it looks like for a zero-sum space? I think number 5 is a really big one for me that I've seen a lot from a lot of students about, like, and a lot of colleagues about there too, is being a knower and being right versus being a learner and getting it right. I think it's very easy to feel like we have to be correct. I feel like I talked to a lot of students that have said these things. I always love kind of some of the good interactive team building experiences where students had a chance in a large group setting to kind of talk through challenges, talk through experiences. And as a debate options and debate experiences, oftentimes I've heard students say, if the goal is to make a decision as a group, they're oftentimes become busy trying to be right. And that's not the goal of the activity. Typically, it's actually about trying to make a decision that is best informed by the group. And that's hard to do. I think it's also, again, part of it is it takes a lot of, it's way easier to try and be correct and be right and prove that you're right versus being able to be honest about that you need to keep getting it right and working towards that. And how can you switch from a position of always knowing to always learning? What are the ways in which you feel like you can model that for your students? And what are the ways in which you feel like you can try and encourage students to do that through your work or through activities? I think also 6 is a great point too, around kind of modeling clarity, kindness, and hope versus hiding behind cynicism. Cynical, being a cynic is sometimes it's okay, right? Like I think you have to be. This is not advocating for kind of toxic positivity by any means, but I think it's important to be mindful of, do you use cynicism as a means of armor? That's easier to be cynical than trying to be honest about what it means to kind of be clear, kind, and hopeful for things. And I think to me, it's a hope that's like based in reality, right? Like I think if you're hoping to see, world peace happen next month, probably not a good realistic place to be hopeful for that. I'm not saying I wouldn't want that, but being mindful of that. And what does it mean for you to try and be mindful of the ways in which you are able to display that with students, but also how do students display that too? I know oftentimes I face a lot from students in working with, for example, the graduate student government, where when they try and get things done, they're kind of pushed to like, let's make a committee or a task force or whatever working group or things, right? And oftentimes that's not the goal. but it can make them cynical. And so part of it's the challenge of how do they help to recognize the reality for there and find hope in it, and also recognize like where they actually have the power to make positive changes in that space. 7 is also important to me too, which is the criticism of self-protection versus making contributions and taking risks. And so oftentimes, it's easy to say in our office, we typically talk about things regarding that, it's way easier to deconstruct something than it is to construct something, right? It's so much easier to give feedback and to critique things than it is to construct. So I think it's important to recognize that oftentimes criticism can be its own form of armor and how we show up in spaces and what that means for us. And so it's important to recognize that it's how do we help to recognize that we can make contributions and take risks that can be rewarded there, again, in ways also that you can create it safely. What does it mean that you can create spaces where it can be done so safely and effectively in ways that are healthy? And 8's a big one, especially within organizations, right? Like we work within a pretty hierarchical system. That's, I think, not really a hot take. That's a pretty clear one in terms of a higher educational hierarchy and a bureaucratic institutional structure. But I think it's important to be mindful of how do we move from power over to power with, power to, and power within. Because I think those are very different concepts, right? Like how oftentimes, we work with student groups and students who are in positions of power where they maybe have power over somebody. If they are the president of an organization, the treasurer, they have a certain role on campus or in an organization capacity, or be mindful too of what it means when they don't have that, right? Like how do they operate within that? And what does it mean to them? Oftentimes this comes down to some of the negative behaviors associated with things like hazing, which you see in any number of organizations across campus or in experiences or teams or other interpersonal dynamics and environments. And so it's important to be mindful of how do we have students recognize and move away from power over to power with or power within. I think 1 or 2 more just because there's a bunch of them. And again, I gave you all lots of kind of space for reflection because they're fairly deep, but I think it's a thing that's important to be mindful of. I do want to mention the number 12, because I think it's so important, again, kind of in that piece of what does it mean to reward exhaustion as a status symbol. I think we've all seen students or colleagues or ourselves at times have that moment of trying to reward that versus kind of modeling support, rest, play, and recovery. I know myself, something I've tried to do for my own intervention, but also with working with students as an intervention means is I've seen some students really actually trying to open up and have conversations where they say, I'm struggling with X, or I really had this hard thing. And, they had 3 test papers, whatever that combination of challenging things for them was. And oftentimes I've seen students respond, oh, well, I had X, Y, Z number of things, tested papers. And that's not what they were looking for. They were looking, hopefully, probably for someone to actually connect with, have a moment with, and they got the opposite, right? And to me, that's kind of like stress Olympics. And I've learned to ask the question and actually ask them so what happens when you get the gold medal in stress Olympics, right? Like, what'd you win? I usually get weird looks, but the answer is really nothing, right? Like you don't actually get anything positive out of that spot, that process. And so I think it's important to recognize that even that itself, the exhaustion, right? Like the lack of sleep, the ways in which we oftentimes can glorify that in order to get things done or to accomplish certain things. Even to be mindful of those students in ways in which they talk about, what it means to be self-sacrificing to attain a goal. What sacrificing is too much that it actually is hurtful and harmful versus potentially, is it a one-time, occasionally, maybe they have a later night than they usually would occasionally. Maybe that's okay to do for them as a sacrifice for that. But if it's every single night, if certain things are doing for that, for their liveliness, for their well-being, then that's a question of what that looks like too. I think 15 is really big for me. I think this is such a huge one that I know we all have definitely experienced and seen. I know I definitely still am working on this one all the time, where it's way easier to kind of obfuscate conversations and to be less direct and to speak around things versus kind of being able to speak directly to or take action from. And so I think to me the zigzagging is challenging. I really appreciated this also as a source if anyone's looking for more learning opportunities. Kim Scott wrote a book called Radical Candor, which has been really great for me, I know personally as a resource. But I think it's important to recognize, right? Like, what does it mean for us to be more honest? And that actually the best thing we could do is care directly about somebody, and because of that care, have an honest conversation. In the book, Kim Scott argues about the challenge of the compliment sandwich being very useless. That the worst thing you can do for someone is tell them that they're so great and wonderful, and that they're actually really terrible, but that they really did a great job in this thing, right? Like, that kind of thing is such a confusing mixed messaging bag. It's the question of when you talk to students and you get feedback, how often are you actually able to really be honest and direct in ways that are developmental, ways that are actually intentional? You know, how often do you worry about those things, or that you help students recognize and model that too? I just had a conversation with some of the students I advised where I had to say, listen, like, you're trying to actively avoid this conversation, and there seems to be a central problem that you're not choosing to address. And if you choose not to address it, that's fine, but that's your choice. And you just need to kind of own that choice that you're making. And so it's important to recognize that oftentimes people have more control and more ability to do that. So again, there's 16 things, it's a whole book and stuff, so I don't want to spend the rest of the time on it, but I wanted to kind of mention these things and point out some of these resources as a means of kind of recognizing that these are some tools to consider using for you to give you all a toolkit for considering how do you have conversations for yourself, for your teams, for the students you work with and for, and with each other, and to recognize, you know, how is it that this can be a resource to find ways to engage in honest and sincere dialogue and conversations around mental health and well-being, right? In and of itself, having that conversation is a way of moving from armor to kind of being a bit more daring to have that conversation in honest ways. I know from my experience with students at the retreat recently and other conversations on campus, where students want to have them, right? They're looking for space to have that. And so if it's in your role, capacity, comfort, I encourage you to do so. Also recognizing there's lots of wonderful staff on campus who can help you have those conversations and facilitate that dialogue very well. So for me, it all comes down to, and why I conduct all the leadership pieces, right? So the daring armored leadership is important. It also comes down to relational leadership. I think oftentimes we don't always emphasize enough kind of how relational leadership is a powerful piece and tool. The ways in which relationships matter. I know I've always heard at every school that I've been to my entire life, except since grad school, that, you know, this school is the most relational school you'll ever be at. And at some point I keep laughing because I'm told that every time I go anywhere, talk to anyone in an organization, or what that means. And I think, you know, part of those is grounded in relationships we have between people, right? But it's always dependent on the context. Its context is also established with relationships we value. And, you know, I think too often that we don't always see relationships as being solution oriented. That takes a lot of work, right? It takes armor that often has to be put down to have meaningful relationships, to have challenging dialogue. But it in part because it requires a high degree of trust, right? Like, I love Renee's kind of definition of trust is a slow building layered process that happens over time. It requires work, vulnerability, attention, and full engagement. It's active, it's a living process. It's something that is constantly moving and evolving. And it's going to be achieved by creating kind of powerful and compelling experiences together. You know, I think a great thing to me is considering what does it mean to truly value diverse perspectives, group members hold. You know, if too often you might come in with a perspective that you're looking for a certain answer, and if you're not honest with that from the beginning, you're setting up people to not even be able to have their perspectives heard or valued, and that creates a lot of disengagement, creates a lot of frustration, creates a lot of negativity in spaces. And so it's important to be mindful of how do you leverage your relationships to ensure that you're actually valuing the diverse perspectives group members hold. So kind of 3 questions to consider. And if you're online, I'd ask you all to throw it in the chat, and I can get or to just unmute and share out. But like, what are the barriers that you experience for developing trust with others in a team? How does this impact your experience, and how have you worked to overcome this?
I think something I experienced when I first got here was being the new person, and navigating, honoring the relationships that the students had and my peers also had with the previous person, or, you know, not even necessarily the previous person, but just with how things were, and being the new person with the new ideas, and that being perceived as intrusive or combative, or like not honoring tradition, or, you know, whatever words you want to put to that, of just being the new human. And so at first it was awful. It made it really hard to, you know, like want to help make change or help build those relationships, or it just felt like barriers of trying to build connections to learn, because for them, it felt often like, well, you just want to change this, or you're new and you don't get it, or, you know, whatever it was. But I think it took time and also commitment to show that, like, I'm here and I'm gonna stay here, and I'm not another human who's gonna, you know, just walk in for a minute and leave. And, you know, it's showing the commitment part of it. And so I think that that's not always the answer, but I think proving and not giving up is a way to show that you're building trust, and that, you know, it's not going to be with everybody on a team, but it takes time. But I just remember that being really hard my first year.
Yeah, thanks,
Trying
Aaron.
to overcome that.
And for me, this comes back to to a lot of it into mental health and wellness, what it means in terms of that, right? So, you know, oftentimes if you don't have trust, it's hard to trust. The lack of trust is foundational to me in terms of what it means as a leadership, right? Within engaging in the leadership process, within helping students learn their leadership styles and experiences and mentalities. And that realistically, it's important to recognize that, like, they have to recognize how they build trust with others. I know that's part of why we all recognize typically that, you know, first year students, especially in those first 6 to 8 weeks, it really is challenging because they don't oftentimes have a network of support on campus. It's really been shifted. So the question of how do we recognize those things, what we do to better support our student leaders, helping to engage and be honest and realize those things. I am even helping to encourage student leaders to recognize, like, how do you make a space in organizational meetings a priority? You know, part of it, often as I've seen from a lot of student groups, is like, you know, you lose members because your meetings aren't really fun or engaging. You're not just getting things done, and you're because you're so worried or focused on trying to get to the next thing, you're not able to actually recognize and help to support your members, or to create opportunities that actually can create them the chance to create community. And I think a lot of students really want to do things that are worth their time. If they don't feel like it's a good use of their time, then they're not going to want to engage. And also that goes into the whole conversation around empowerment versus deliberating, kind of delegating out responsibilities, but that's a different conversation. And it's important to recognize, right? Like, these are all challenging things. I think it's important to recognize, like, how have you overcome this, or also how can you help students overcome it? What are the things you're able to do this kind of self-work for this? And recognize also too, regarding mental health and bringing it back to the student wellness and well-being, that, you know, there are some things that can be done and overcome with that stuff. And also, what happens when trust is broken, and how do you then help to rebuild that trust, right? And that's also, again, requires a lot of the armor to be taken off to have those honest conversations. This is a brief reminder about a theory that's out there from the involvement theory. And I just kind of heard this told, but I want to really emphasize, like, in those bullet points below, like the first one is that example of excessive involvement, the workaholic, the academic grind mentality, right? Like, those are all things that are really problematic. I typically don't love older articles, but this one still feels very relevant, if not more so than it did before. And so I think it's important to recognize, right? Like, how do we oftentimes help students recognize that, you know, there's that point of diminishing returns when it comes to their involvement and it comes to their experience, right? Like, that, you know, having 10 things on your resume, if you can't really talk to them importantly, or if you can't really highlight how they've been helpful for you, maybe isn't as good as having 2 or 3 things that you really liked and focused on and really built you up and helped you to be more effective academically, personally, more fulfilled. You know, I think it's important to be able to ask ourselves, again, and having these conversations with the students is hard because they're coming from a lot of socialization around what it means to them to try and have those things. They hear all kinds of messaging, I know, about, you know, what they have to do in order to have a certain resume to be effective, or to have a certain thing, you know, in order to be able to be competitive for a certain type of a job or experience. And oftentimes isn't based in reality. It's based on one person's kind of socialization that oftentimes they pick up on that isn't, again, always based in the best experiences. And so I just asked him just to kind of mention that, remind everybody that's out there, but more importantly, the example of excessive involvement as a challenge to that process, and they recognize that, you know, as we encourage students to find that, how we encourage them to find that meaningful involvement that is additive, without also adding 9 other opportunities for involvement that kind of really drives them to be more pulled and less able to be focused and more and less effective, and also less happy in their experience. You know, mental health matters, right? So kind of last but not least, right? Just kind of some reminders. I do love the oxygen mask piece, right? So as you're flying on planes, the reason why we put oxygen masks on ourselves before others is we have to take care of ourselves first and foremost. I think I know I found that be very helpful. I've seen some good research on too in terms of resilience building is how we define success for students. What does that mean, right? And so part of that is helping them recognize that oftentimes, again, if they can come back from something that's been challenging for them to build up resiliency, it's recognized they actually might still be succeeding, right? Even in failure, they still can succeed in learning different lessons, what that looks like for them. But I can help students define that for themselves, because typically, if students are relying on other messaging they're hearing from what it means to be successful, that means they probably are defining a 4.0 with a certain kind of job, financial income opportunities, resume, all those experiences being successful. And that's not what success looks like. I know I've seen lots of students, and I'm sure we all have, and who have not had that resume, but are still very successful in any number of things. How do we ask for and give grace? And how does that in that process, right? In order to be able to be effective in putting down armor, we have to ask for grace from others. We have to also give grace. And I always put the caveat too that obviously if people kind of burn through the grace piece, that's a bit challenging, but it's important just to recognize, how do we ask and give and receive it? And that part kind of goes into accountability. How are we able to be accountable with being mindful and supportive? Again, going back to the first piece of intention versus impact, right? Like how are we restating and first-stating that? So just because accountability looks like something to you, doesn't mean that's what it means to somebody else. It's very important to be that. And how's that being messaged to and with students? So. Thoughts, questions, comments, challenges they're having, or ways they're trying to find ways to engage in their work?
I'll add, because this has been on my mind. I think with all of the like pieces that you pulled apart from Renee Brown's article, a lot of it goes back to like just needing connection and not feeling alone in whatever you're dealing with. They might not have to be vulnerable about the whole life story, right? But still, I think that I hear a lot from my team too of like, I appreciate coming to SLO because we can actually talk to each other. You know what I mean? Like they're in a space with different people, different perspectives, and they don't really have that kind of I guess natural space in the classroom a lot of times. And so that's one thing that I think is just a part of this conversation, is just like, how are we building authentic connections, or just space for them to connect? We don't even always have to be there. Yeah, so that was just on my mind.
So one of the things that stuck out to me in the beginning is what you said about failure and failing gracefully and modeling graceful failure. And one of the things I've noticed since being here is like this refusal to fail to the point that the ultimate failure is way worse than what it could have been.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I'm just trying to be cognizant of, if students do come on my radar, like, it's okay, like it's way more common than you think, like, and I just think and again, going back to what you said about perfectionism too, there's just like this, I can't get to that point, and then eventually it's even worse than what it could have been. And I don't know, that part is something I'm working on with my students, but it's hard.
Yeah. And it's environmental, right? Because
Yeah.
a lot of students have that pressure again in terms of what it means to get to Carolina, the work they put in to get here, regardless of if they're in an undergraduate degree or a graduate professional track. It's important to recognize there's so much pressure and that comes in that's oftentimes been internalized and that oftentimes can be weaponized as well. And so it's really important and critical to be mindful of how we help students work through that, because oftentimes those are the things that cause some of the biggest barriers, and those aren't things that are even being put on them all the times. But it's the ways in which they perceive and receive that messaging over years. Or also that they're again being told or messaged from friends, colleagues, family, who knows who that person is or who's doing it to them, but oftentimes can be focused around what it means to be successful. So how can help students really define for themselves that challenge? And what does it mean to be vulnerable, to be able to be authentic and creating that space for themselves? Awesome. Well, Next month, we are providing lunch, so we're sending out more information for that too. And also this got recorded, so if anyone's watching this and you're watching the recording, great. But otherwise, I didn't know one. But thanks y'all and have a good day.